If you think about it, Tempest Hawk is kind of like a flying Phyrexian arena. And if you can run as many Phyrexian arenas as you want in a deck, say 30 or so, odds are you're probably going to have a lot of cards in your hand at any given time in the game. Now, the problem, obviously, with Tempest Hawk is that it's kind of a bad card, and it only draws more copies of itself. So, Tempest Hawk, 2 mana and a white for a bird creature that's a 2/2 with flying, and when this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a card named Tempest Hawk, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and, of course, a deck may have any number of cards named Tempest Hawk. As I said, the problem is that 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer is not a very good rate. These creatures are not very efficient and not very good. So what can we do if we have a ton of them in our hand because every single one of them draws more copies of itself? What we're doing with this commander deck is probably discarding them. Enter Magetta the Lion. So Magetta is a legendary human spell shaper. He is 5 mana for a 3/3 human spell shaper with an activated ability that says 2 white, tap, and discard 2 cards to destroy all creatures except for Magetta. Those creatures cannot be regenerated. Now, normally this ability is pretty bad because having to pay 5 whole mana to get this creature out, wait a whole turn so it doesn't have summoning sickness, pay 4 more mana, tap, and then discard 2 cards from your hand is just a big ask to wipe the board. But again, as I said, if our deck is full of 30 birds that draw more copies of themselves, we are going to have way too many birds in our hand that we know what to do with. So what we can do is use them to wipe the board. That's the premise of this commander deck. Thank you guys so much for being here. This is the Cybersnap channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and let's get into the deck tech. So as I said, Magetta the Lion is the commander of this deck. This is a mono white deck, and we're using Magetta to filter our hawks that are just sitting in our hand into essentially Boardwipes. And if we can keep Magetta on the table, we can keep wiping the board, deploying more hawks, drawing more hawks, wiping the board, deploying more hawks, drawing more hawks, etc. That is sort of the game plan of what we're doing with this deck. I've broken down the list of all the cards that we're including here into a few broad categories, and the first of which, as you may have guessed, is Tempest Hawk. We are running 30 copies of Tempest Hawk. Generally, what's going to happen is on turn 3, we are going to play a Tempest Hawk. On turn 4, we are going to attack with Tempest Hawk, draw another Tempest Hawk, play another Tempest Hawk, and then on turn 5, we can attack with 2 Tempest Hawks, draw 2 Tempest Hawks, and at that point, we're off to the races. We're just going to continue drawing more Tempest Hawks and filling our hands up with these birds. Now, naturally, we're not always going to be lucky enough to cast a scary 5 mana commander with only 3 toughness, have it sit on the table uninteracted with, and actually get to untap with it and use this commander's ability. One of the flaws with this strategy is that Magetta is kind of slow, and our opponents are going to see this board wipe coming from a mile away. They will have time to prepare, and odds are they will probably try to remove Magetta. So we are running some redundancy in this deck in terms of finding other useful ways to pitch the Tempest Hawks from our hand and get value out of them beyond just playing them as glorified storm crows and actually putting them onto the table. So the first category I want to look at is our pitch category. And pitch just meaning spells that ask you to either exile cards from your hand as an additional cost, discard as an additional cost. That kind of vibe is what we're going for. So the first in our pitch category is Argentum Masticore. This is a 5 mana 5/5 artifact creature with first strike and protection from multicolored. And then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you have to sacrifice this unless you discard a card. But when you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to the mana value of the discarded card. So yeah, this is a 5 mana, pretty efficient body. It's got first strike. It's got some built-in protection. The drawback is that you have to discard a card on your upkeep. But again, if you've got a couple of hawks on the table, that means that you're drawing 2, 3 extra cards every turn. Your hand is going to be overflowing. So discarding one of those hawks on your upkeep isn't going to be a downside. It's actually going to be an upside because you're discarding the hawk and then blowing up one of your opponent's 3 mana things every single turn. So this card is pretty useful for being an efficient body, doubling as removal, and again, sort of using the hawks in your hand as an alternative resource. Next in our pitch list of cards is Force of Virtue. This is a 4 mana enchantment that says if it's not your turn, you may exile a white card from your hand rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And it is a flash enchantment that says creatures you control get +1/+1. Playing this for 4 mana is very bad. You almost never want to do that. A 4 mana anthem that just buffs all your creatures +1/+1 is very off rate. However, if you can pitch a hawk and cast this at flash speed on an opponent's turn, you're getting a free +1/+1 to all of your hawks, making them all 3 mana 3/3 flyers, which is a lot more efficient than their base stat line. So this is another great way to use those extra hawks that are just piling up in your hand as you keep attacking with Tempest Hawk. This next one is a little cute. I want to test this card. I'm not sure how great this card actually is, but I really do believe that in this deck, we are going to have so many cards in hand that having Hypochondria is going to be worth our while. This is a 2 mana enchantment. It has an activated ability that says you can discard a card from your hand to prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to target creature or player this turn. And then it has another activated ability that says you can pay a white and sacrifice the enchantment itself to do that same healing salve ability. So basically what this does is as long as this is on the table, it turns all of your Tempest Hawks into healing salve, which is an old Magic card that's a 1 mana thing that says prevent the next 3 damage to a source of your choice. I just think it's efficient. Having only to pay 2 mana to get this down onto the table, and then all of a sudden you have the modality on your hawks to prevent the next 3 damage to yourself, to prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to one of your creatures, whether that means you're blocking and then your blocker is not going to be destroyed in combat, if that means you're attacking and your attacker is getting blocked, if somebody tries to bolt your commander Magetta, who unfortunately does only have 3 toughness, this protects him from that. So I think that there's just a lot of play to this card. I'm curious to test it out, but I do think just paying the 2 mana to give that mode to all of your Tempest Hawks that are going to be accumulating in your hand over the course of the game is a nice sort of extra dimension to add to what is kind of a boring 3 mana 2/2 flyer. So yeah, I want to try this one out. We'll see how it goes. I think it's a good slot for this pitch category. March of Otherworldly Light, this is just a great card. It sees play outside of jank discarding hawk strategies. This is 1 an X for an instant that says as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of white cards from your hand, and then this spell costs 2 less for each card exiled this way. And then you can exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. So if you just pay this for X is 0 and 1 mana, you can exile a 0 mana thing if you want to, but you could also exile a hawk from your hand and just pay 1 mana to play this where X equals 2 to exile a thing that costs 2 mana. You could exile 2 hawks from your hand to exile a thing that costs 4. You could split the difference and pay some mana into X while also exiling hawk from your hand. So this is just a very versatile removal spell that's going to hit most threats in the format and do it very efficiently at instant speed while giving you another use for all of those hawk cards in your hand. Reverent Mantra, another great pitch spell. This is 4 mana for an instant, and it says you may remove a white card in your hand from the game instead of paying its mana cost. And then it says all creatures gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So yeah, you can pay this for 4 mana. It's not going to be efficient at that rate, but if you just exile 1 hawk from your hand, or any white card from your hand, you can play this for free to protect all of the creatures on your board and all the creatures on the board from the color of your choice. It can protect Magetta if somebody's trying to remove him. It can allow you to block a bunch of creatures that are coming in aggressively without actually trading your blockers or chumping with your blockers. Another interesting use for this card is it does affect all creatures. So if your opponents are trying to get cute with spells that target their own creatures, if they're putting auras onto their creatures, this stops like animate dead loops on your opponent's side of the table. If you select black, all creatures gain protection from black, and that animate dead is going to fall off. So you can do a lot of interesting sort of counterplay with this card, but really the great thing about it is you can use it to protect your board when you're completely tapped out and your opponents aren't suspecting you to have interaction. Solitary Confinement. This is one of the spicier pieces in this build, and something I think that is going to end up being one of the more important pieces in this build. This is a 3 mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Solitary Confinement unless you discard a card, and skip your draw step. So that's a pretty big drawback, but what does it actually do? It says that you have Shroud and prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. So this card is awesome. Usually it's really hard to maintain and keep out on the table because not only are you skipping your draw step, but you have to keep discarding cards to keep it out on the table. But if you have just 2 Hawks, 2 Tempest Hawks on the table, and this on the table, that means that every turn you can attack with 2 Tempest Hawks, put 2 Tempest Hawks into your hand, and then at the beginning of your next turn, you could play even one of the Tempest Hawks if you want to, and then discard the other one at the beginning of your next turn to keep this around. But basically, as long as you're drawing at least 2 cards per turn, your hand is going to stay equal, essentially, and you'll be able to keep paying for the discard cost of this card. Once you start to get more than 2 Hawks on the table, then this thing is just an easy upkeep cost to pay of discarding a Hawk every turn. The one downside is you won't be drawing your lands, but later on in this deck tech, there are some other ways that we can get around to it. I'll drop a quick hint and say that we are running land tax and Weathered Wayfarer. So if you have one of those out while you're in your Solitary Confinement, you can get lands every turn as well without actually doing your draw step. So that's another interesting pitch spell in our pitch category. Another one we have is Solitude. Obviously, this is probably the best white pitch spell. It sees play in many different formats and many different decks. 5 mana, 3/2 flash lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 other target creature. That creature's controller gains life equal to its power. And then the evoke cost is exile a white card from your hand, and you can cast this for free just by exiling the white card. And then when it enters the battlefield, it sacrifices itself. So yeah, this is a 0 mana removal spell. You just have to exile a Hawk from your hand, and you can take any creature off the table. And the final card in our pitch category is Sunscour. Now this is a 7 mana sorcery that says to destroy all creatures, but you can remove 2 white cards in your hand from the game rather than paying Sunscour's mana cost. Once again, you're going to have so many Hawks in your hand, exile 2 of them, and you have a 0 mana board wipe here. And the really great thing about it is you can play this for 0 mana, wipe the board, and then have all your mana up to deploy more Hawks after this resolves, and then start accumulating more Hawks into your hand. So that's pretty much everything for our pitch category. Counting our commander himself, we can use Magetta to discard 2 Hawks to wipe the board, and then we have all of these cards that also take advantage of having lots of these creatures in our hand. The next category that I want to go into is our recursion category. A lot of what's going to happen over the course of a game is our hawks are going to die, our hawks are going to be discarded into our graveyard with Magenta, our hawks are going to be killed by activating Magenta's ability and killing our own hawks. So some of what we want to dedicate our deck to is cards that can bring hawks back onto the table, and ideally cards that can bring multiple hawks at a time back onto the table. So the first card we have in our recursion category, Ascend from Avernus. X and 3 white for a sorcery that says return all creature and planeswalker cards with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then exile this card. This is one of our best recursion options in the deck. You're just paying X is 3, and then you get 3 white, 3 generic into X, and then you get to return all of your Tempest Hawks from the graveyard onto the battlefield. This is going to be an explosive play in the late game as you've been cycling through your Tempest Hawks, as they've been dying, as you've been discarding them to Magenta's ability. Just being able to pay 6 mana and get, 5, 10, 15 Tempest Hawks onto the table is going to be a huge swing in a game. This kind of is, as you can see, it is a 2-for-1. In the sense that we have 2 different options that are both very good for our deck on Dusk to Dawn. So the Dusk side of this card is 4 mana sorcery that says to destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. Now, unfortunately, this does kill our commander if we have our commander on the table, so that's something to keep in mind, but all of our Tempest Hawks are going to dodge this Boardwipe because they only have 2 power. So it'll kill all of the larger creatures, leave all our Hawks in place. The second part of this card, Dawn, is a 5 mana sorcery that it's an aftermath, which means you have to play it from your graveyard. And it says you can return all creature cards with 2 or less power from your graveyard to your hand. So this doesn't put them onto the battlefield, but it does return them to your hand. It's going to refill your hand in the late game with Hawks. Another interesting piece about this is that Dawn side is cast from your graveyard. So in a pinch, if you need to discard this card to Magenta's ability, if you don't have enough Hawks in your hand to discard, you can just discard this and then still get the value of casting Dawn from your graveyard later in the game. Helping Hand is a 1 mana sorcery that just says return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I know I mentioned that most of our recursion we want to bring multiple Hawks back at a time, but this is just so efficient for 1 mana. You're paying 1 mana to get a 3 mana card from your graveyard onto the field. I'll take that every single time. So very efficient recursion piece with Helping Hand. Reunion of the House is a new card as of the recording of this video. This is a 5 and 2 white, so a 7 mana sorcery that says return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then exile this card. So this can bring up to 5 Hawks from our graveyard back onto the battlefield for 7 mana. So you are paying 7 mana for 15 mana worth of Tempest Hawk. So yeah, that's a great option again in the late game once you have up to 5 Hawks in your graveyard. If you can just pay 7 to bring 5 of them back out onto the table, you can start going to town and swinging with them, drawing more Hawks out of your deck, and deploying more Hawks, and hopefully killing your opponents from above. Season of the Burrow is a very versatile card in this deck, as are all of these season cards, but this one is 3 mana and 2 white for a sorcery that says, oh boy, choose up to 5 paw prints, I guess we'll say, worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. So the first paw print is an ability where you pay 1 paw print to make a 1/1 white rabbit creature token. The second mode is you can pay 2 paw prints to return target exile target non-land permanent, and its controller draws a card. And then the third mode is you can pay 3 paw prints to return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield with an indestructible counter on it. So yeah, this does a lot of things. You could just pay 5 mana and pay the one paw print mode 5 times to make 5 white rabbit tokens. I think most of the time you aren't going to want to do that. I think most of the time what you'll do with this card is use the 2 paw print ability to exile anything that's on the board. This does count as a removal spell in our deck, and it will be included in our removal package as well once we kind of get into that. But yeah, you can take anything off the table that you need to, and then you can pay the 3 paw prints to bring one of your Tempest Hawks back into play. And that Tempest Hawk is going to be indestructible, which is really nice combo with our commander, because all of a sudden we have one Hawk that's going to stick through the activation of Magetta going forward after this has the indestructible counter on it. So we can bring Magetta back onto the table, we can activate Magetta, and then he's going to destroy all creatures except our indestructible Hawk and himself. So at that point, you're almost doing a one-sided board wipe. We have another new card. Smile at Death is a 5 mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, return up to 2 target creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and put a 1/1 counter on each of those creatures. This card synergizes really well with our commander because we're discarding 2 Hawks to activate our commander. This sees that there are 2 Hawks in our graveyard at the beginning of our upkeep, and then brings both of those Hawks back into play, and with +1/+1 counters on them. And the fact that it just does that every turn for as long as this is out on the table makes this a really, really strong and resilient piece in our deck. If opponents don't answer this, it's going to get out of control very quickly, especially if you just keep your commander on the table. If you get to keep activating Magetta, keep bringing Hawks back, you can get into some nasty loops with this card. Storm of Souls is a 6 mana sorcery that says return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each of them is a 1/1 spirit with flying in addition to its other types. Exile Storm of Souls. This one isn't quite as great as the Ascend from Avernus, but again, it is only 6 mana to bring all our Hawks from the graveyard back onto the table. It shrinks them from 2/2s into 1/1s, but it does not take away that ability. So when they attack, when they connect for damage, they are still going to draw you into more Tempest Hawks that you can then later play as 2/2s if you want to, or again, pitch to all of the cards that we previously went over. So yeah, 6 mana, bring all of your Hawks back is going to be pretty good, regardless of whether or not they're a little bit smaller. And then the last card in our recursion category is probably pretty predictable, but Sun Titan, Commander All-Star, sees play in decks all over the world, and this deck is very good for it as well. It's a 6 mana 6/6 Vigilance. And whenever it enters or attacks, you can return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you pay the 6 mana, this thing comes down as a big body, and it brings a Hawk from your graveyard back onto the field. That's great. If it sticks around and gets to attack, it brings another Hawk from your graveyard onto the field, and that's just going to keep snowballing. So yeah, this is sort of a must-answer threat in this deck. And that is all that we have for our recursion category. Next, let's go ahead and let's briefly look at our ramp package. We aren't running a whole lot of ramp in this deck. First of all, mono white is not necessarily known for its ramp. Second of all, there aren't a whole lot of ways to ramp into an early turn 2 Tempest Hawk without using very expensive Moxen and other various mana rocks that are going to break your wallet if you have them. Whatever ramp you can run to get a turn 2 Hawk is going to be helpful for you in this deck. The only one that we're running, because I have an extra one in my binder, is a Lotus Petal. This is a 0 mana artifact that you can sacrifice to add a mana of any color. So if you have Lotus Petal, you can go turn 2, play a land, have 2 planes on the table, play your Lotus Petal, sack it for a mana, have 3 mana on turn 2, and play your first Hawk. That means you're going to start drawing Hawks a whole turn earlier than what you might have otherwise started with on turn 3. Some of the other ramp that we're running in this deck is Herald's Horn. So Herald's Horn, 3 mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and then creatures that you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put that card into your hand. So yeah, this enters the battlefield. You choose bird. This makes all of your Tempest Hawks cost 2 instead of 3. And then at the beginning of your turn, if you have a Tempest Hawk on top of your library, you reveal it, draw that card, and then draw an additional card as your card for turn. So yeah, it's a really efficient sort of ramp piece. Even it's more like a mana reducer, I guess, but it is also drawing you extra cards. It is a little awkward because it costs 3 mana, so normally once you're on 3 mana, you want to cast a Tempest Hawk. But since this reduces your Tempest Hawks down to 2 mana, you can play this on turn 3 and then actually drop 2 Tempest Hawks on turn 4. Yeah, so very efficient piece in this deck. Another card in our ramp category is Locket of Yesterdays. This card is kind of a staple for any of those you may run any number of this spell type cards. This is 1 mana for an artifact that says spells you play cost 1 less to play for each card with the same name as that spell in your graveyard. So yeah, if you have 2 Tempest Hawks in your graveyard and this on the field, suddenly all of your Tempest Hawks only cost 1 white mana to play. That's going to get out of control very quickly. So yeah, this is one of the stronger cards in our deck in terms of ramp and mana efficiency, and it can just come down on turn 1, which is kind of awesome. We have a Pearl Medallion, great in mono color decks and mono white decks specifically. This is 2 mana for an artifact that says white spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Once again, this makes all of your Hawks cost 2 mana, so on turn 4 you can play 2 of your Tempest Hawks rather than just 1, which is a big deal. This comes down on turn 2, so it starts reducing your spells on turn 3 instead of the Herald's Horn, which you have to wait a little bit longer for. So yeah, this will end up saving you a lot of mana over the course of a game. Sol Ring, obviously, nothing else to say there. And Thought Vessel, this is a 2 mana artifact that says it taps for a mana, so it's a mana rock, but importantly, this says you have no maximum hand size. So we are running both Thought Vessel and let me go over to Reliquary Tower in this deck. There's just a lot of advantage to being able to hold on to all of these Hawks that we're drawing because of our pitch strategy for this deck. So our hand is going to get huge. We want to be able to hold on to as many of those cards as possible. So Thought Vessel and Reliquary Tower, and even in our land package, which we'll go into a little bit more later, we are running Urza's Cave to go find Reliquary Tower if we need to, as well as our, as we alluded to earlier, Weathered Wayfarer we can use to find Reliquary Tower. So yeah, we definitely want to have no maximum hand size when we're playing this deck, and we have several ways to go about doing that. But that's it for our ramp package, and I think we can go ahead and move on to protection. As I said, Magenta is pretty vulnerable at just 3 power, 3 toughness for 5 mana. People are going to see that activation coming and want to remove him. So let's see what kind of protection we can fit into this deck. Some of these cards we have already looked at. I've double tagged them in terms of categories if they have multiple functions. But this first one we haven't looked at yet. This is Flare of Fortitude, which is 2 and 2 white for an instant that says you may sacrifice a non-token white creature card rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And until end of turn, your life total can't change, and permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible. This card is great in this deck. You are going to have a Hawk on the table that you can sacrifice to play this for free, and essentially what that's going to mean is you're sacrificing 1 Hawk to protect all the rest of your table as well as your life total. So if somebody is swinging out at you with their whole board, if they're trying to alpha strike you and you're tapped out of mana and looking vulnerable, this is gonna save your life. If someone tries to targeted removal on your commander, this is gonna save your commander's life. If somebody tries to board wipe when you have a bunch of birds out and you don't want those to go, this is going to save your birds' lives. This is just a very useful and versatile protection spell for this deck, given that you are usually going to be able to activate it by sacrificing one of your hawks. Flawless Maneuver, another just really kind of exceptional protection spell because you can play it for free. It is normally 3 mana for an instant that says creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. But if you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. So yeah, I think like this is going to be important on the turns that you tap out to play Magetta, and all of a sudden everyone again is going to see that you have a looming board wipe, try to remove him, but even on the turns that you tap out to cast him, you can rely on this card to protect him if somebody tries to use destruction-based removal on him. Hypochondria we talked about earlier. I categorized this under the protection area because, again, being able to pay 1 mana to discard a hawk to prevent 3 damage to a target means that you can prevent 3 damage to your hawks and to your commander if somebody tries to use like a red removal spell against him, like a lightning bolt or a a lava coil or something like that. You can use Hypochondria to save his life by just paying 1 white mana and discarding a Tempest Hawk. Lightning Greaves kind of goes without saying. You can play this earlier on in the game, cast your commander, and then just equip it for free, even if you're out of mana after casting your commander. So that's great. It gives it Shroud, it gives it haste. And but another really great use for this card in this deck is that you can play this on turn 2 and then play a Tempest Hawk and immediately equip this to give the Tempest Hawk haste, so you can attack with your first hawk that comes down of the game and immediately draw into a new hawk on that same turn. And then after that, you can play another hawk, give that hawk haste, and it sort of gets that feedback loop of hawks drawing into more hawks for you started a lot sooner. And just for equipping for 0 mana is a great option for this deck. Reverent Mantra, we talked about that in the pitch section already. Again, just a great protection spell that you can just exile a Tempest Hawk from your hand to give all creatures protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. You're going to have a lot of tricks in this deck when you're completely tapped out of mana. So that's one of the advantages to being able to just pitch all of these hawks that we're drawing into to use them to protect the ones that are actually on the board. Sajiri Shelter is a MDFC that we are running technically in one of our land slots. It is a 2 mana instant that says target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So it's not the most efficient version of this ability. Usually this kind of effect costs about 1 mana. This one costs 2, but the upside being that it is a land on the other side of this card, so you can play it as a land if you need to. It enters the battlefield tapped, but, it's a land. Solitary Confinement we talked about. You can get into some really interesting locks with this card. Again, if you have a few hawks on the table to keep refilling your hand, even if you're not drawing cards every turn and you actually have to discard cards every turn, as long as you can keep finding more Tempest Hawks out of your deck, you can keep this lock going. Again, if you have land tax or Weathered Wayfarer on the table in addition to your hawks, then you're drawing more lands every turn, you are also drawing more hawks every turn, and you're not even going to miss your draw step with this card. One other thing is I do think that this is such an important piece in this deck. We have a few other important enchantments that we care about in this deck, but this one is so important. I did include Hall of Heliod's Generosity in our mana base. This is a legendary land that taps for a colorless, but you can pay 2 and tap it to put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. So if somebody does have the Naturalize or the Disenchant or whatever for our Solitary Confinement, so long as we don't die the turn that it gets removed, we can put it back on top of our deck and continue to deploy it and continue to put ourselves in our bubble that hopefully will keep us from dying to our whatever our opponents are doing. And yeah, with that Hall of Heliod's Generosity, the same sort of like land search package applies for that too. We can find Hall of Heliod's Generosity with Urza's Cave, and we can find it with Weathered Wayfarer as well. And then the last protection spell that I'm including in the protection section has also been included in my removal section, which we'll look at next. But Swift Reconfiguration is a 1-mana aura with flash that says enchant a creature or vehicle. And the enchanted permanent is a vehicle artifact with crew 5, and it loses all its other card types. So this is a really interesting card. It does see play in some CDH combo lists when you have green, because if you turn a Devoted Druid into a vehicle, all of a sudden you can make infinite green mana. That's not what we're doing with it here. We are playing this card fairly, but it is a very flexible card even when we're using it fairly, because we can technically use it as a 1-mana removal spell on an opponent's creature. Yes, they can crew it for 5 to turn it back into a creature, but at instant speed there's going to be so many ways to just disrupt what your opponent is trying to do with their creature by turning it into a vehicle that is no longer a creature. So that's one use for this card, but the reason why I've included it in the protection part of this deck is that we can cast it targeting our commander to no longer make it a creature, but really we don't care about Magetta being a creature. It's actually more convenient for us if it's just an artifact. That's going to be a little bit trickier for our opponents to remove. That 3 toughness won't make it as much of a vulnerable target because it's no longer a creature. So yeah, you can cast this Swift Reconfiguration in response to some kind of kill spell, and all of a sudden, yeah, it's not a creature anymore, but I still have that 4-mana activated ability on what is now just an artifact. So that's what we're doing for our protection in this deck. We just have a couple more categories to look at, so let's go ahead and take a peek at our removal package. Argentum Masticore, we already talked about that card. 5 mana for a 5/5 first strike protection from multicolored. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can you have to sacrifice it unless you discard a card. And when you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls with a mana value less than or equal to the discarded card. We included this in our pitch category because you are needing to discard Tempest Hawks in order to keep this engine going. But as long as you can keep it going, it's just a kill spell every single turn on a body that is not embarrassing. A 5-mana 5/5 with some built-in protection. This is going to do a lot of work for you in this deck. Alright, sorry about that. We had to come inside because this poor old computer was about to die. But let's just continue on with our removal package for this deck. We talked about Masticore. I'm going to actually, for the sake of being able to see what's going on here, move over here. So we have Dusk Dawn, which we also talked about, is a 4-mana kill spell that dodges all of our hawks. So that is great. And then we can also use it later on to bring some hawks back from our graveyard. Iganjo is something we can just fit right into our mana base, which is awesome. It's just an untapped white source that is a land, but you can also pay 3 mana to discard it, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and it costs 1 less if you have a legendary creature out. So yeah, just being efficient with how we can slot more removal into our deck. This is one way to do it. March of Otherworldly Light, we already talked about, just a great versatile removal spell that becomes especially great once we can start exiling hawks from our hand to pay for that X cost. Razor Grass Ambush is another spell that we can just fit into our mana base. It's a 2-mana instant that deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. But on the other side, it is just a land that can enter untapped even if you pay 3 life, and it taps for a white mana. Season of the Burrow we already talked about. The mode that's important for removal here is that 2 paw prints where you can exile a non-land permanent and its controller draws a card. If you wanted to, you could even do that twice, where you exile 2 things, the owners draw a card, and then you can use the last paw print to make a 1/1 rabbit. Solitude we already talked about. in our pitch section, just one of the most efficient cards that you can pitch a white card from your hand to pay for the cost of. This is essentially just a Swords to Plowshares that you can play for free by exiling a hawk. Sunscour, once again, costs 7 mana, but you're just exiling 2 hawks from your hand to play this card to destroy all creatures for essentially free, have all of your mana untapped, and then play whatever you want to as a follow-up to the board wipe. Swift reconfiguration we talked about. We can use it to protect our commander, but you can also use it to turn one of your opponent's creatures that they actually want to be a creature into just an artifact. Swords to Plowshares kind of goes without saying. I was looking to fit a Path to Exile into this deck as well, because I do think that most decks that are in white should just run Swords and Path. I ended up cutting that path for the Swift configuration because I think it just synergized with our commander a little bit more. I like the option of being able to use one of our removal spells to also protect our commander. But yeah, Swords to Plowshares is just too good to exclude. It's 1 mana, exile a creature, and then its controller gains life equal to its power. Should go into every single white commander deck. And the last removal spell is another one that we have fit into our mana base. This is a 4 mana, Witch Enchanter is a 4 mana 2/2 human warlock, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. And again, on the other side of this card, it is just an somewhat untapped land. It enters untapped if you pay 3 life. So yeah, that's what we're doing for our removal package. You notice maybe that I guess 3 of those actually count as land slots. So we are running a few less lands in our generic land category. But before we go into our lands, let's take a look at just the last 5 cards that I couldn't really find a clean category for. So I've just labeled them as miscellaneous. The first in our miscellaneous category is Brave the Sands. This is a 2 mana enchantment that says creatures you control have vigilance, and each creature you control can block an additional creature. This is just going to be such an important defensive piece in this deck, because really what you're trying to do is you are trying to attack with Tempest Hawk every single turn that you can attack with Tempest Hawk, so that it's replacing itself and finding you another hawk. One downside of that is you are not often going to have many blockers up. So if you can get your Brave the Sands down in the early game, all of the sudden attacking with your hawks comes with no downside whatsoever because they have vigilance, so they stay up to block even after they have attacked. And not only that, but they can block 2 creatures. So if you're chumping with one of your Tempest Hawks, you can actually chump block 2 of your opponent's attackers as long as this card is out on the table. So that just does so much for you defensively, especially just for 2 mana. So I think that this one was a no-brainer for this deck. Land tax we already talked about. It's one of the strongest white card draw spells available. It is a 1 mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for up to 3 basic land cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. So yeah, this is just putting more cards into your hand. Obviously, it's going to help you find your land drops. But yeah, in addition to that, you can have extra land cards in your hand to also discard to your commander or discard to some of your other pitch abilities that don't care about them being white cards specifically. So yeah, it's just going to be putting lots more cards into your hand. It works really well with our solitary confinement lock because that's our way that we're going to find more land drops every turn while we're skipping our draw step. And it's really nice with our no maximum hand size cards because not only are we thinning our deck out by pulling 3 basics out of our deck every single turn and putting them into our hand, but if we have our Thought Vessel, if we have our Reliquary Tower, we don't even have to discard down to hand size. We can just hold on to those and use them later. Soulcatcher's Airy is a fun sort of synergistic one for this deck. This is a 2 mana enchantment that says whenever a bird is put into your graveyard from play, put a feather counter on Soulcatcher's Airy, and then all birds get +1/+1 for each feather counter on Soulcatcher's Airy. So this is just a really efficient anthem. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything when it first comes down. You need at least one of your birds to die before it becomes a regular anthem. But yeah, once this is on the field and one of your Tempest Hawks dies and this gets a feather counter, this is suddenly just a 2 mana anthem, which is like a pretty good or at least standard going rate for an anthem. As long as this is on the table and like it has 2 feather counters on it, 2 of your birds have died, suddenly a 2 mana +2/+2 buff to all of your creatures is kind of huge. Like if you can just get 2 feather counters on this card is crazy. But it's not going to stop there. Your birds are going to be dying over the course of the game, and as long as this thing stays on the table, it's going to just accumulate more and more counters and make your guys bigger and bigger to potentially even finish the game eventually. Along those lines, Valley Quest Caller is another just very efficient anthem. This is kind of a lord. It's a 2 mana 2/3 rabbit warrior, and it says whenever one or more other rabbits, bats, birds, and or mice you control enter, you scry 1. And all of those cute critters just listed also get +1/+1. So yeah, this is again just a 2 mana anthem for all of your birds. And on top of that, whenever one of them enters, you get to scry 1. I love that this just curves into a Tempest Hawk, so you can play this on 2, and then turn 3, play your Hawk as a 3/3 and scry 1 when it enters. There's just a lot of value to be had there. And then, yeah, lastly, Weathered Wayfarer. We're running this for several different reasons. It's great to just help us find our land drops, especially if we can do it multiple times. I guess I'll read the card. 1 mana, 1/1 for a human, where you can pay a white and tap it and search your library for a land card. Doesn't even say basic. Reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle. Activate only if an opponent controls more lands than you. You're mono white. Someone's going to be playing green at the table. That shouldn't be too hard to accomplish. So yeah, like you can find your land drops every turn, but not only that, you can find your specialized land drops. You can find your Reliquary Tower so you don't have to discard the hand size. You can find your Hall of Heliod's Generosity to keep looping your Solitary Confinement. And we'll go into a few other non-basics that we're running in this deck, but yeah, that utility that you have with this card is great. And again, if you have your confinement out, your Solitary Confinement, and you're worried about still continuing to make your land drops while you're not allowed to draw a card on your upkeep or for your draw step, you can use this to consistently find those land drops. So yeah, that's almost all of the deck here. The last thing that we'll go into is just take a look at our lands briefly. We've already looked at most of these. You'll notice again that there's only 34, but that's not counting our 3 modal dual-faced cards, so we are running a total of 37 in this deck. One of them is Arid Archway. I like this card for a lot of reasons. It is a land desert that enters tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. If another desert was returned this way, you get to surveil 1, and it taps for 2 colorless mana. So this is just a bounce land that you can run in monocolor decks. I think it's really great for that reason, especially in white decks, because we have those cards that care about you having less lands than your opponents. This is going to help you accomplish that, while also just putting one of your lands back into your hand so you can make your land drop for the next turn. This is essentially entering and drawing you a card just for the price of being a tap land, which I would say is a worthy trade-off if you're not running too many other tap lands in your deck, which we are not. Igonjo we talked about is just, it basically is just a plains, except it doesn't say plains, but it can also be used as a removal spell in a pinch if you need it. Once again, we also talked about Hall of Heliod's Generosity, just an untapped, taps for a colorless land, but you can use it to recur your enchantments. You can bring your Solitary Confinement back. You can bring your Smile at Death back. You can bring your Brave the Sands back. There are a few enchantments in this deck that are going to be very worthwhile if we would like to get them back on top. Mistveil Plains. The thought with this, well, I'll read it first. It's a plains that enters the battlefield tapped, but it can tap for a white mana, and you can tap it and tap a white to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Activate only if you control 2 or more white permanents. The thought is that eventually you are going to run out of Tempest Hawks, so in a pinch, you can use this to shuffle your Hawks from your graveyard back into your library. I guess they do go on the bottom, but something else to note is every turn that you attack with a Hawk, you're shuffling your deck. So you are going to be shuffling whatever card you put back into your deck. It's not going to stay on the bottom for very long. It will shuffle in, and there's chances you could just draw it again as well. So you can use this on cards that are not Hawks also, that you're just hoping to see later in the game. Put them on the bottom of your deck, attack with Tempest Hawk, search your deck for another Tempest Hawk, and then shuffle, and suddenly that card that you put on bottom is somewhere else in your deck. 27 regular planes. I know that's a lot of basics. I like playing a lot of basics. You could probably fit more utility lands into here, but I just think it's important to have a lot of basic lands for a lot of reasons. Maybe I'll do a whole video on that at some point, but this one's getting long, so let's keep moving. We have Reliquary Tower. Again, is just one of the more important utility lands we have in this deck, and many ways to find it, including Urza's Cave, which can be sacrificed to find any of our lands and put them out onto the battlefield. And then the last one is a Scavenger Grounds. Taps for a colorless. You can tap 2 and tap it to sacrifice a desert to exile all graveyards. It's really important to be able to fit some graveyard hate into this deck. Someone's always going to be doing some nasty stuff with their graveyard. Even though we're kind of doing that a little bit in this deck too, it's good to have the option, and it's at such a low opportunity cost by just putting it in as one deck slot. And technically we do have one other desert in the deck, being the Arid Archway, so these two cards kind of synergize with each other a little bit as well. But yeah, that's what we are doing with our Magetta the Lion Tempest Hawk build. Thank you so much for staying to the end of this video. Let me know your thoughts about this deck in the comments below. Let me know if you have any other cute ideas for Tempest Hawk that you might be trying in the future. And yeah, just have an awesome day. Thank you so much for being here. Sub to the channel if you haven't already, and have a good one.